Well, welcome to Google.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really, really glad. So people have been really struggling with the notion of faith for, I think, time immemorial. What motivated you to write the book at this time?
Well, after I wrote my first book, which was on the American Jewish community, I was sort of surprised at the reaction I got. A lot of people would come up to me who were clients or friends or in organizations. They'd say something to the effect of, Scott, you're sort of a reasonable type of person. Mm-hmm. What is it about, whether the Jews are around or not, what is it about believing in a God that makes you, that really motivates you to want the Jews or to want any religion to stay around? And I would get one of three responses to people, from people. I'd get a response of, you know, Scott, the religion is sort of like believing in the tooth fairy, Santa Claus, or Zeus. Haven't we all outgrown it? Haven't we learned that that doesn't make any sense? It's totally irrational. What are you thinking about? And then the second reaction I would get was, you know, I really believe in God, but it doesn't make sense. I understand it's not rational. I just sort of park my rationality at the door. And then the other reaction, and the third reaction, which I would get, frankly, most rarely, was, yes, I believe in God and it's rational. So I kept having these conversations with people. Actually, the conversations were happening at me. And so I started to read all of the evangelical atheist books, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens, Why God Poisons Everything, sure, et cetera, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. And then I looked for a response. And the odd thing was I couldn't find a really good response that represented my view, which is that it's rational to believe in God, in the God of the Bible, with all we know about science and the historicity of the Bible itself, okay, and our sense of modern morality. And so once I couldn't find a book, I started to think about whether or not I ought to write that book.
Okay. So basically, you were looking for an answer, couldn't find one, and decided, all right, what the heck, I'm going to write it.
Well, yeah, that's sort of the way I look at a lot of things. If there's an unanswered need, I mean, that goes for business, that goes for organizations, if there's really an unanswered need. And if, at first, I didn't think I was necessarily the person to write this book because, you know, at Asset Liability Committee at the bank, we're not usually talking about God. And I actually originally thought, well, maybe I'll get with a group and we'll commission a book. Mm-hmm. And that didn't really work out. And I had some very definite things that I wanted to convey because I think this is so important. I think that we've lost touch with why faith is so important, how it shapes so much of the good of modern society. And I just didn't see enough people making that argument in a way that was open to everybody, believers and non-believers. Like so many phenomena in our modern society, people are either writing for believers or writing for non-believers. So as you mentioned, I made a point of having folks review my book and doing research on my book with people who absolutely were atheists and people who were certainly believers.
Mm-hmm. So there may be quite a number of people actually sitting out in the audience or who are going to see this who may be non-believers. What do you think that they're going to get out of this book when they read it?
So here's the thing that I think is the core of why this book is so important for secular people and why I think I make a contribution to our contemporary conversation. And that is that we've had a lot of books, Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer, potentially Yuval Harari, making the case that all we need is reason and that reason is good enough. And I really think that's dangerous because reason is essentially neutral. Reason is great if it's not coupled with idolatry. And unfortunately, what I've found is that in so many cases, reason is coupled with idolatry. And then reason can lead to all sorts of horrors. And let me back up, because I think the thing that most people don't get is what idolatry really is. And they're not used to the way that the Bible frames the concept of idolatry. Most of us think idolatry is just about bowing down to idols or statues or the like. But the Bible frames the concept of idolatry very carefully. Idolatry is a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing superpowers or super authority to finite beings, people like you and me, natural processes, ideologies, or in the ancient world, animals, not so much today. So we sort of think, and we have a Passover Seder that says, well, we overturned the God King Pharaoh 3,300 years ago, so let's have a meal and let's eat. But in reality, the whole 20th century has been a catalog of God King Pharaohs. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler, the Assad family, the Kim family, and I can go on and on and on. They all created idolatrous regimes using the exact same tropes as Pharaoh did. Myth, parades, pageantry, temples of some sort or another. All backed up, of course, with very powerful armies and groups of secret informers. So how, for example, did a Stalin get, just to pick one, get the authority, and people accepted his authority, to starve a quarter of the Ukraine, to kill all the kulaks in the Soviet Union, and to send tens of millions of people to the Gulag, and nobody questioned him. And it was because he used all of those same tropes. He even had the ability to have the Soviet Space Agency broadcast his image into space. And how did Mao get 30 to 75 million people to literally march to their death? And nobody questions his authority. So just to complete, that happens on a big level, but I think at a macro level of nations and countries. But I think what's also worrisome to me, and part of the reason I wrote this book, is because it also happens on a micro level. So for example, how did Charlie Rose, Harvey Weinstein, recently we've been reading about Jeffrey Epstein, Matt Lauer, how did they get to abuse people in a way that they did? Well, their authority within their industries. Harvey Weinstein was unquestioned and unquestionable, and he had aggregated to himself a super authority in his industry. He really could ruin people, and people's careers really were derailed if they didn't do what the God King Harvey Weinstein wanted. And we see people setting themselves up as idols and creating their own truths, creating their alternative realities, if you will. And that's very, very dangerous. So the problem of idolatry is huge. And reason alone, we've got a lot of books, as I mentioned, Enlightenment Now, The Moral Arc, etc. And I think that they're very interesting, but unless there is an understanding of what idolatry is and the golden rule, as we've talked about before, I think reason can take us in some very, very dangerous directions.
Well, actually,
reason alone.
True. One of the things actually you describe idolatry was you almost describe the inmates as being in a prison of idolatry, but a fun prison almost, pageantry. I think you actually compared Rome and Greece. You had the pageants, et cetera, and so forth. You were talking about that. So how do you break out of that?
Well, so the Bible, through its stories, speaks about how to break out from that. And it also speaks about the dangers of trying to break out of it. It would be very hard for someone in Stalin's Soviet Union to oppose Stalin. They'd probably be killed, and their family may be sent to the Gulag as well. And the same thing was true of the Exodus story, which is the story starts with the Egyptian midwives, two women who are told to throw all of the Israelite baby boys into the Nile. But they don't do that. They resist, but they can't tell Pharaoh, well, it's not right to throw Israelite baby boys into the Nile, babies. It's just not right. They can't say that. So they actually have a very, very subtle and deep understanding of Pharaoh as an idolater, because they play into his lies. They say, the Israelite women give birth, and they use this word in Hebrew, chiyot, they give birth like animals. They give birth and we don't even need them. And Pharaoh believes it. He doesn't even think that Israelite women are like other women, like Egyptian women. He's willing to accept that they are animals or vermin or whatever it is, the same sort of tropes that Hitler used. And so they're able to get away with the lie, but they have to understand Pharaoh's alternative reality, play into those lies and do it, because it's not easy. And Pharaoh's daughter does the same thing when she saves the baby boy Moses floating down the river. It would have been so easy for that princess to just look the other way. If she just would have looked away for a second, everything would have passed by. And the boy would have passed by, the cradle would have passed by, and she could have gone on with her cushy life. But part of what I think faith does, and what understanding what idolatry is you need to figure out how to resist it. And she does. Again, she also plays into her father's beliefs about himself, but she has the strength to recognize you need to resist idolatry. She thinks and recognizes that if that really were her baby boy, she wouldn't want that child to just float down the river and die. And so it's sort of like the golden rule, and she gets that.
Okay. So Yuval Harari, in a recent talk he actually gave at Google, posited, bringing it to the concept of idolatry, that he knew a great deal about God, and God's a petty lawgiver. And then he proceeded to talk about female dress codes, burning heretics.
Yep.
You have a quote actually inside the book, Mark Twain, "If there is a God, he is a malign thug."
Yep.
And that, if you actually read the Bible, it's loaded with sexism, racism, it promotes the death penalty, and we've got a ton of idolatrous people wrapped in, quote, monotheistic clothing. What's your answer to that?
So my answer is that the less people read the Bible and study the Bible, the less they like it. So one thing that I've done, and I think actually I get a lot of thank yous for this, because I try in the second section, is to take the most troubling parts of the Bible and to unpack those. So for example, most of the people who read the Bible that way totally decontextualize it. They act as though the Bible was written last Thursday, or they don't read the whole story. So if let's say a Martian arrived in the United States the day before Osama bin Laden was assassinated by the United States, and all of a sudden the newspapers are filled of people cheering the murder, the death of Osama bin Laden, he would wonder, what kind of people are these Americans? Well, now, if someone explained to him, well, 9/11 happened, a lot of things happened, and contextualized it, they may or may not agree that President Obama ordering the killing of Osama bin Laden was good or not, but they would understand why. And when it comes to a lot of the complaints, a lot of the critics don't focus on the fact that the Bible is often talking about pretty offensive acts because it is against those acts. I mean, in terms of Yuval Harari and others quote the end of Judges, where there's a civil war and where where a concubine is chopped up and raped and terrible things. But the Bible is criticizing that. It says there's no king in Israel. I mean, it's literally saying, how could people stoop to be doing this? And the other thing that I think people don't realize is that they read the Bible cold, not thinking about how people who really, really cared about the Bible at the time interpreted the Bible. So, yes, there's a death penalty in the Bible, and it's there pretty often. But on the other hand, the way it was enforced was very different. One rabbi in the Talmud says that if a Sanhedrin sentenced one person to death every 70 years, it was considered a bloody Sanhedrin. Another rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, in the Talmud says, well, if he were on that Sanhedrin, there wouldn't have been any death penalties. And it goes on that the Sanhedrin in the time of Hillel actually abolished the death penalty by moving out of a certain place and saying that it no longer was capable of executing the death penalty. The Bible also doesn't allow confessions, which are the lifeblood of the American justice system, sadly, and have sadly put many, many people in prison. So they're not looking at it. Nowhere, for example, does the Bible actually endorse slavery. It says it recognizes there's an institution and then softens it dramatically. If a person hurts their slave, if a slave is wounded, the slave goes free. It creates lots of regulations and it's difficult to read the Bible without recognizing that the end goal is to get rid of slavery. And that's why so many abolitionists were reading the Bible, I think, in a very sincere and open way.
Let's go back and talk about women.
Women. Okay. Well, first of all, let's compare again the Bible to literally any text from that era. Women had no agency. I mean, if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, the most a woman did was hold off suitors, or she was kidnapped and brought to another city as a prize. That was it. Women had no agency whatsoever. They were not major actors in anything. The whole story of the Bible consists of women being really, really major actors. If we talk about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but really, the decision makers are Abraham, Rebekah, and Jacob. Rebekah makes all the major decisions. Tamar, later in the story, in the Joseph story, is critical. The story can't go forward without Tamar making major decisions and manipulating Judah. The Exodus story that I talked about, if you set aside look at the whole Exodus story, Genesis is the first book. Deuteronomy, Devarim is the last book, which is really Moses' speech. The whole Exodus story is bookended on each side by 5 courageous women. On the front side by the two Egyptian midwives that I talked about, plus Pharaoh's daughter, plus Miriam and Moses' mother. And they all take action that's very risky. They're all agents. There's actually no men to be heard of. And then at the end of the book, at the end of the book of Numbers, it ends with the story recapturing the daughters of Zelophehad. And who are these? Most people have never heard of the daughters of Zelophehad. But here's a story in the Bible where the Bible says men inherit. And what are the 5 daughters of Zelophehad? They say, no way. They go to Moses and they say, talk to God. And God goes and changes the rule so that women can inherit. So no, the Bible was not written post the Civil Rights Act in the United States, but it empowered women, it empowered Devorah, it empowered a whole host of women in the Bible. There are prophetesses, judges, and warriors who are women. And again, I think the impulse in the Bible is to recognize that it was a patriarchal society, but to say women can and should have agency. And indeed, many women that I've spoken to say that they have various heroes. Esther, I could go on and on. Yael, from the Bible.
All right, let's switch viewpoints just a little bit, because we are at Google. We are a technology company.
Yes. One that we all use multiple times every day.
Every single day. And we've been talking a little bit about idolatry and how we can occasionally assign excess value to things, not just people, but things as well. Can you talk about the dangers of idolizing technology and perhaps secular advancement? And have modern scientists and intellectuals really substituted the worship of God with something else?
Well, you mentioned Yuval Harari says that the future gods are going to come from Silicon Valley. I think he said it here in his previous talk. There is a great danger of technology taking us in places that we don't know. And again, the Bible speaks through stories. And I'll give you just one story that I think actually people don't look at, but it actually relates to technology, which is the story of the Tower of Babel. In chapter 10, there are many people in many languages. And then somehow, in chapter 11, in just 8 verses, this whole story is encapsulated. And somehow in chapter 11, they find themselves that they've discovered bricks. And they've discovered mortar. No longer do they need to build houses out of stones. That's great. So the first thing they set out to do is to build a city. And that's great too. And then the second thing they do is they say, well, let's build a tower to the heavens. And by the way, there's nothing in the story that says that they had any evil intent. They just lose track. Here is a valuable technology, bricks and mortar. It allows people to have shelters. And rather than build hospitals, rather than shelter people who don't have shelter, they start building this tower to the sky. And that's pretty unuseful. They start to literally idolatrize the technology. And we, unfortunately, do that too. And it's pretty sad in many ways in that we ascribe, as I talked before, a super authority to technology. Well, technology has to have our values. And we can't just trust the algorithm. I'll give you a story that my longtime partner, Lou Ranieri, and I had been very involved in credit scoring and studying credit scoring. And we looked at it in the 90s, and then we looked at it again in about 2015. We started to really study credit scoring and realized that the technology had changed so dramatically that now virtually everybody can have a credit score. There's so much data about every individual from social media and from other sources. Everybody can have a data score. And yet what worried us both is that even if the algorithm is forbidden from knowing the race, creed, or gender of the individual, there's still tremendous danger to credit scoring because it can know your whole network. So if you are part of a network that historically didn't have access to credit or historically defaulted more, it wouldn't know that you were a white woman, but it would know that you're XYZ prime, and the people that you have in your network tend to default, and therefore you're going to tend to default, and therefore we're going to give you a lower credit score. And for your whole life, you're going to pay more for credit, more for insurance. You're not going to get accepted into the apartment you want to rent. It's a real problem, and we don't pierce through that. Even our technology, even if we want to make it pristine and blame it on the computer, we can't really do it because it has to have the input of our values. And that's why, I really worry about where we get our values from. And that's why I keep going back and back in the book to the golden rule. And that's something that we talked about beforehand, and maybe we want to go into more.
Yeah, so absolutely on the golden rule. So you do cite the golden rule quite a bit. Of late, there's I actually like you kind of cite the Hillel's version of the golden rule, which I think is probably more on target, at least for me, which is that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. Do you think that that's something that maybe is missing from perhaps the new atheist vision of when they're looking at the Bible? Because a lot of them are basically saying, like, to believe in this is just insanity. They can't. What do you get out of it? Because from their perspective, basically when I think Dawkins, I think it was, or I think it was Dawkins, basically was just like, well, morality is basically what's good for everybody is good for, or good for the larger number of people is good for society as a whole. You definitely don't agree with that if you read the book.
Definitely don't agree with that.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you my introduction to understanding how secular people can quickly fall into idolatry and how they can quickly set aside the golden rule. When I first moved to New York, I lived at 95th and 3rd.
Okay.
And I used to take the train from 96. And I don't know if anybody, probably nobody here remembers the Lexington line from when I was doing it. It was un-air conditioned and it was really, really bad. You didn't want to be on the Lexington line in the summer, and actually you didn't even want to be on the winter because you were so squished and sweating by the time you got there. Anyway, one day, a middle-level trader pulled up just as I'm walking down, and he says, I'll give you a lift down. And he said, by the way, I come by here every time at the exact same time. If you want a lift anytime I'm not traveling, you can get a lift. So these are the antediluvian days before cell phones. And my only cost of this trip was listening to his philosophy, and I quickly realized that what his philosophy was sort of a mashup of what's good for me and my wallet is best, and a little bit of Peter Singer. And he would say, he didn't mind if he screwed the other party to a transaction because as long as it was allowed within the rules, that was fine. There was no golden. He was so Machiavellian. He wanted to make sure that he donated to the right political candidates, that if people talked about income inequality, they nodded sagely, like he agreed. But he didn't care about anybody or anything except what was good for his wallet and his family. And I found that that's what happens to a lot of folks who say, well, I'm secular, but they can easily fall in and into the idolatry. I talked to, and this is the other part of what's good for the most people. So I have someone who I know is the medical director of a major insurance company. He said to me that we can cut medical care costs in the United States easily by 20% if we just provide routine care for infants under 30 days and for adults over 80 years. Mm-hmm. And then that money can pay for probably free community college for everybody, maybe even free college for people. And it can do a whole bunch of good. But yet, that comes from the setting aside of the golden rule. And Peter Singer takes it a step further. He says, basically, if you discover an infant or a young child before 2 is not going to have a fulfilled life, is not really going to be a person, well, you should euthanize that child. And an adult who becomes unaware and non-sentient, also, what is the harm in euthanizing that person? Many people have protested him because of this, because of what they understand the implications of his thinking are. But it's exactly the same. It's reason without being coupled with the golden rule, quickly becoming idolatry. Because who's going to decide who is insentient? Who's going to decide who should be euthanized? Well, the way Peter Singer describes it, it's whoever decides on who a person is. And so you need a chief person, in which case, Peter Singer would be the chief person to say, okay, this person is on this side of the line and that non-person is on that side of the line. And by the way, if you read the first ethics, the first medical ethics handbook ever written, which was written by a Nazi Germany doctor, it sounds pretty similar. If someone's going to be a cost to society, if they're a vegetable, if they take resources away from society, the greatest good is letting that person be killed. And there's really, from a pure reason perspective, there are counter-arguments, but there's no logical defeater. The only logical defeater is thinking, if I were that other person, would I want to be treated that way? If it's hateful unto me, just the way Hillel said, if it's hateful unto me, would I want to do that to somebody else? And that gets back to the micro examples I talked about, the Harvey Weinsteins and the Charlie Roses of the world. They don't believe in the golden rule. It's okay to abuse other people, but it's certainly not okay for them to be abused. They're on a higher level. So the link between idolatry and the golden rule, I think, is very tight, and we need to glue it together because, again, if we don't, I think that's when the horrors can start on a macro basis and also, sadly, on a micro basis in our most intimate encounters.
Okay. So, I mean, we've obviously the presence of idolatry, and you've talked about Harvey Weinstein and a lot of the unfortunate, the Holocaust, et cetera. I know your father was a Holocaust survivor. My grandparents were all camp survivors. One of the arguments that the new atheists make is, okay, you say there's a God. If that's the case, why is there evil?
Right. Well, so first of all, I do tell the story in my book about my father's relationship with God. And this is in a way, you asked where I started the book. Actually, that's what in a certain kind of way I've been thinking about it ever since I just inculcated my father's experience. My father was a great man, just an incredible man. And an incredible will. When he was liberated from Dhaka, he was 60 pounds, and he was probably days away from death. And he was so fortunate he was liberated by the American Army because they nursed him back to health. At those point, if people were just given food, from the concentration, they died. And at that point, the American Army knew enough not to do that. And my father was always so grateful to the United States of America because he knew he'd be dead. But I tell in the book a little bit his story about how if things had been just a little different, in so many cases, he would have not survived the war. I mean, almost if this bottle had been moved over there, he would have been dead. Right. So many small things saved his life that he was actually pretty certain there was a God, but he was really, really angry at God because he had seen his father murdered, he had seen his brothers murdered, he had seen he hadn't seen his uncles murdered. But, I mean, my closest relative on my father's side is a second cousin once removed. So everybody was wiped out. There's a difference between understanding that evil exists in the world because we sadly have free will, than not believing in God. And that's something that my father did understand, unfortunately all too well, the importance of, again, that golden rule. I mean, the way that Nazi Germany demonized the Jews was to compare them to vermin. The vermin, of course, aren't subject to the golden rule. And God, as we are told in the Bible, gives us freedom. Freedom to make some awfully big mistakes. Freedom to hurt each other. And our test is to stand up to that. Our test again and again is to stand up to that. And there were, unfortunately, people who saw what was going on, who didn't act when they could have. And in a way, the story of the book of Esther is about people acting when they needed to act and acting in time. And there's a way for God to prove his existence. Anytime we do something wrong, just have a lightning bolt come down and strike us. Right. But then there'd be no value in humanity. We'd be automatons. And to a certain degree, life is a test. Are we going to stand on the side of good? Are we going to do what promotes redemption, ultimate redemption and peace in the world and repairing of the world? Or are we going to avert our gaze? And that's the lesson that the Bible gives us over and over and over again. That's something that, if you read it, we're not very good at learning, but we're getting there, hopefully. Well, I don't know. The 20th century sounds pretty Old Testament-like in terms of its history. That is definitely true. So one last question, I think that we, especially going back to, I think, given the audience from Google, the new atheists talk about science, especially, that it's just not compatible for someone who believes in science to actually believe in the Bible.
Although, just throwing out there that a 2009 Pew study actually that you cite in the book, revealed that 51% of scientists actually do believe in God. And as a point of order, I looked it up last night. Professor Christian Anfinsen of Johns Hopkins, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, actually cited only an idiot can be an atheist. So just as an FYI. You offer quite a bit of material that science has actually not disproved or eliminated the need for God. Want to go into that just a little bit?
Sure. Well, I didn't, in the book in section 4, I really go into why science and the Bible and belief in God really don't contradict each other. There's so many, the science, and I'm a big believer in science. I mean, we're here because of science, and our modern technology is due to science, but there's no way, people shouldn't believe the canard that somehow science disproves the Bible. And I do that with the creation of the world, the creation of the universe, and evolution. I'll just take one little point, because we don't have the time to get into detail. So scientists say, the new atheists say, and I'm paraphrasing a few of them, they all say, you believers have this preposterous idea that God created the universe for this little planet in the corner of a typical galaxy far in the corner, following a unremarkable or circling an unremarkable sun, and we're here for some short period of time. What a wasteful God. How could so much be produced for just us in this little tiny corner of the galaxy? So their response is to come up with, in my view, a far more preposterous story for the creation of the universe. One that's possible, of course, but just if you take the 6 major constants that, gravitation, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the dark energy force, so to speak, pushing the galaxy away, etc. 6 major constants. You can Google this. And you just come up with the random chance that those constants would be in a form to support life. Some of them are actually, those constants are really, in a certain kind of way, ridiculous, such as the gravitational force. Well, you can do the math yourself, but the random chance of that happening is about 10 to the 140 power. Now, just everybody here probably knows because they're at Google, but the atoms in our body are about 10 to the 28th power, and all the atoms in the universe are about 10 to the 78th power. So the new atheists want us to believe that 10 to the 140th power, which is a gazillion times more than a larger number than the number of atoms in the universe, 1 over that huge number, I mean, we'd have to keep writing these zeros probably to fill this building, is the chance of us existing. And all of these other multiverses must exist that came from a quantum flux somewhere in nothingness and created all of this. Is any of that provable? One part of that provable? No. It's just as unprovable as Carl Sagan's dragon in the garage. And yet we're supposed to accept that and say, well, because we have this, not hypothesis, not even, well, they would call it a conjecture, which is a fancy word for a guess, that you shouldn't believe that it's possible that a creator God created the universe. Actually, I think Occam's razor would say a created universe actually makes a lot more sense.
In other words, don't buy the lottery ticket.
In other words, yes, if you have a choice between those odds of 1 over 10 to the 140 or buying a Bible, definitely buy the Bible.
Okay. And with that, if anybody has any questions, please. And we got one.
Okay. So I think, first of all, we packed a lot into this talk, and there are a lot of layers, and it's hard for me to pick one question, but I'll try. The first half of the talk, it seems like you're suggesting that faith and belief in God is some kind of inoculation against idolatry and the dangers of idolatry. But I feel that, that is not a true claim, because First of all, I fail to remember cases in history where actually religion acted as an immunization from the horrors of mankind, including the Holocaust. And I would ask, notwithstanding all the other questions that we have about belief in God and the Bible and its value, why shouldn't we preach teaching reason, skepticism, and doubt over religion as a much better and effective inoculation against idolatry?
Okay, so I totally think that religion and faith need to be coupled. Reason and faith need to be coupled. I think that any time that you believe anything without evidence, without reason, and one of the things I argue in the book, we don't have time for it now, but I think that monotheism is a reason-based belief. But anytime you decouple those, you can get idolatry. If I just believe in my God, King Pharaoh, who has the power to do whatever he or she does, if one believes in Hitler as a superpower, if one believes in Stalin, Mao, etc., people with super authority, without evidence, without some reason, then yes, we can go off the deep end. And here's the point. I think when you talk about religion, I think that there's two types of religion. There's monotheism and there's idolatry. The problem is, I think most people are religious one way or the other. It's just I think too many people are idolatrous. And as I've argued, I think that if you have reason and you don't link that with just the simplest thing, the golden rule, I think I've tried to explain it, try to explain in more detail in my book, how you can really go off the deep end really, really quickly following your God, King Pharaoh.
Tiny follow-up?
Go for
So
it.
you mentioned the golden rule, which is a really important point. And, so the problem with even monotheistic belief with zero idolatry is that, at least as far as, the evidence that we can gather, God fails to objectively present herself, in a way that we can all see and experience. And therefore, belief in God creates the space for fake idols to step in and assume the role of the voice of God. And so I would argue that this, even a monotheistic belief, detracts from reason and skepticism, and does not add to it.
So here's my response to you, and it's to some degree what I've said, but if God presented herself and struck you down for asking such a heretical question, you would have no free will. You do exactly whatever it said to do in whatever faith you believe. You would lose your free will. And the case and what I've said, using actually 10 courageous women in the Bible, the ones at the beginning and the end of the Exodus stories, they stood up. They didn't avert their eyes. They passed the test. And the test is, again, something hateful is happening. Something's bad is happening. Would we want that to happen to ourselves, to our family? And if we step up and do that, I think we quickly find ourselves on the right moral path. And that's why I don't think you can prove God, and I don't think you can disprove God. I think it's unprovable. I just want to make a good common cause with believers and not believers. But I think riding the train that just reason works, I think is very dangerous for all the reasons I've given. I think we got the next.
We have another question.
I definitely admire your motivation of looking for the book that you wanted to read and not finding it and then choosing to write it.
Thank you.
I've read and listened to a lot of also debates between people who are atheists and religious. And I think there's one argument that I've heard that I haven't heard the other side of, so I'd love to hear your take on it. First heard it from Stephen Fry, a British thinker and writer, who said, why would there be a good God who, with humans, we understand there could be evil because of the free will. What about the animal kingdom? Well, one animal will, eat another animal alive. I think we have to accept that they do suffer pain. There's nothing humans can do to stop that. So why would there be a good God that creates animals that humans can't change, who inevitably suffer in ways that seem to be unchangeable?
Well, that's a problem that I think is to a certain degree addressed in the Bible. And it's in the beginning stories. The first 11 chapters, I argue, in the book are metaphorical. They're not mythic, but they're supposed to teach us major lessons. And let's just remember the first chapter of the Bible. First thing that happens in the Garden of Eden is that the animals and everything is created. The animals are created. The human beings are created. And then what happens right after that? The first thing that God says is, to all of the humans, you can eat vegetables or fruit. To all of the animals, you can only eat the vegetables. So the idyllic world before the humans had the first
Laughs.
laughs, was, what a beautiful place. It was heaven. This was a predator-free zone. And actually what destroyed that, and I think this is a little bit of a lesson for us today, what destroyed this beautiful predator-free zone, no animal had to look over his or her shoulder, was the snake character resented the fact that human beings could have fruit. So the snake tries to get the human, in this case the woman, and the man to eat fruit, and give it to presumably the snake. The snake tries to essentially undo the Garden of Eden. That's what the snake character is all about. It's not about a snake. Some people think that the first chapter is about a tree and a snake and a person. It's really a lot deeper than that. And to a certain degree, resentment, that first human resentment, which goes against the golden rule, if you will, poisons everything. And I would say God doesn't poison everything. Resentment and not abiding by the golden rule poisons everything.
So I do get that for so it seems like the Bible does then agree that animal suffering, and it certainly prohibits humans from causing animal suffering, but the animals to each other, you're saying that it is an ideal state for them not to be predators or frankly prey, but it doesn't seem like we can do anything to change that, even if humans do perfect ourselves. Is the assumption is that that would change at some point? There's the lion shall lay down with the sheep, which is usually understood metaphorically. So I'm just curious if you see that as an aspect that could change in the universe according to this religious view.
Well, that is the messianic view. In the time of the ultimate redemption, when we reclaim that sacred space of the Garden of Eden, when we reclaim a society that deserves that somehow will be all in better balance. But on the other hand, you know, and I do go through this in the book, I mean, we are creatures who have evolved, and we evolved from other animals. And that's, you know, part of the mystery of the world and the mystery of the universe and our adaptability. And you know, unfortunately, you have plenty of human beings who are predators too. People who really prey on other people in the worst kind of way.
So you speak a lot about religion and kind of needing reason. Without that, it sort of goes off the rails, which I think we've seen through history. Can you speak maybe more about why reason needs religion, like in the face of even ethical and moral philosophies that come up with the same ideas, like Immanuel Kant's maxims are very similar to the golden rule. So why is it that reason kind of needs religion? Well,
so the closer you get to the golden rule, and I am perfectly, again, happy to make common cause with any atheist who will ascribe to the golden rule, because my feeling of the golden rule, my view of the golden rule is it describes the common divinity that all of us share. You know, the first thing the Bible says is that we all have a spark of divinity. That's how we're created. There's something about us. Now, an atheist wouldn't say that, but an atheist wouldn't necessarily, you know, say either way whether or not there's some common spark among all humans. But atheists who do say, and rules of ethics based on reason that do emanate from the fact that I shouldn't do what is hateful to someone else, I wouldn't want someone to do something that's hateful to me, to someone else. That's enough. I mean, that essentially encompasses the golden rule. But if you read most of other philosophies, utilitarianism, and I mean, a whole host of secular philosophies, again, they quickly come to bright lines. I mean, Kant comes very close, I agree with you, to the golden rule, because he's talking about, any act that any act has to be universally correct. On the other hand, and we don't have time for this now, there are some ways that even the golden rule would not be equivalent to that. There are some times when it is appropriate to do things that would violate the Kantian rule, but are totally in sync with the golden rule. So I actually challenge people to come up with a secular philosophy that can at some point go off the rails, unless either there's somebody reasonable or there's that golden rule. And if there is, again, I'm copacetic. We're good. If there's not, I'm going to wonder. I'm going to wonder what instance you're going to say, well, this other group should promote itself over everybody else. Because essentially, idolatry, in a certain deep way, idolatry and the golden rule have a very deep linkage. Because if I can do something to someone else that I wouldn't want done it to me, essentially, I'm deifying myself. I'm accumulating some super authority that doesn't belong or deserve to go with the other person. And I think that's why, again, that notion of idolatry and the golden rule are so critical and need to be taken into account with all of the folks who are arguing reason alone is enough. I again think reason alone could be good, could be really, really horrible.
Thank you again for coming to Google, and thank you so much for talking about it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to all the Googlers.
Thank you.